For people around the world in the decades after World War II, the threat of nuclear war was reality. The utter devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated the staggering power of nuclear weapons, and as the United States and the Soviet Union embarked on an enormous nuclear arms race during the Cold War, history seemed as if it was going to repeat itself. Despite the obvious dangers of nuclear weapons, the two superpowers continued to produce progressively larger and more powerful bombs at an exponential rate, exacerbating the potential for nuclear war. The onset of the hostility of the Cold War increased this threat, pitting two nations with devastating nuclear capability against each other. However, several far-sighted leaders recognized the potential for conflict and compromised their nation's ideological differences in order to prevent widespread catastrophe. With the inauguration of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, a series of negotiations between the leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, significant strides towards disarmament and harmony were made. Although the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks did not completely eliminate the nuclear threat, by limiting the various types and quantities of nuclear weapons and sponsoring diplomatic activity, they ushered in an era of peace and security within the turbulent Cold War, restoring a semblance of stability to the chaotic world. The end of World War II was met with celebration from all members of the victorious Allies. However, this conviviality was short-lived, as relations between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly deteriorated into one of the most enduring and straining conflicts in history, the Cold War. Since the beginning of World War II, the Soviet Union's relationship with the other Allies had been precarious. The capitalist doctrines of Great Britain, the United States, and France fundamentally conflicted with that of the Communist Soviet Union, but the ideological chasm had occupied the backseat for the duration of the war. Once Germany surrendered, however, their political incompatibilities rose to the forefront. Desperate for a communist buffer zone between itself and capitalist Western Europe, the Soviet Union installed puppet governments in Eastern Europe, agitating the United States, who strongly objected to the spread of communism. As a result, the United States endorsed the policy of containment, dedicating itself to halting further expansion of communist governments. President Truman, in a speech before Congress, formalized this idea by pledging the United States to intervene internationally on the behalf of capitalism.
We must take immediate and resolute action.
The Soviet Union subsequently denounced the United States and their support for free enterprise, driving the wedge between the two countries even deeper. As a result, the differences between the two adversaries were irreconcilable by the 1950s, setting the stage for 5 decades of hostility and the subsequent nuclear arms race. Indeed, the buildup of weapons followed the buildup of tensions. Within the 3 days from August 6, 1945 to August 9th, over 150,000 people died in the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Countless more people died from radiation after the blasts, constituting an unimaginable loss of human lives. Such was the grand debut of the atomic bomb, the deadliest weapon to blight the Earth yet. In unleashing what President Truman called a harnessing of the basic power of the universe, the United States issued a figurative challenge to the Soviet Union, implying that the Americans were poised to dictate international affairs. At first, the United States enjoyed a monopoly over nuclear weapons productions, with the Soviet Union struggling to replicate the atomic bomb. However, after discovering vast uranium deposits in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in Kazakhstan on August 29, 1949. In response, the United States countered with the testing of the hydrogen bomb in 1952, 1,200 times as powerful as the one dropped on Hiroshima. In 1953, the Soviet Union matched the United States, thus stimulating the arms race as each country became locked into a perpetual cycle of design and redesign.
When we were on the end of producing some of the propulsion for some of those offensive weapons, and every time we made an advancement and had a better missile, then from that point in time, most of the threat was in the Russian side of the equation. And they would then up their defense capability, or they would increase their offense capability. And so
bomb strength continued to grow explosively, and on October 23, 1961, the Soviet Union tested Tsar Bomba, or King of the Bombs. This monstrosity of a weapon released 100 megatons of force, more than 33 times the force released by all the bombs that exploded in World War II. Just as the power of nuclear bombs grew insatiably, the types of nuclear warheads and launchers diversified during the arms race, increasing their already destructive capabilities. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs, and multiple independently targetable vehicles, or MIRVs, greatly increased the range and destructive potential of nuclear warheads.
An incoming warhead at 17,000 miles an hour is very, very difficult to intercept.
At every turn, each side desperately strove to outstrip the other, and the arms race spiraled out of control as the quantity and quality of the nuclear weapons reached absurd numbers. By the dawn of the strategic arms limitation talks in 1967, the United States and the Soviet Union collectively harbored almost 40,000 nuclear warheads, each with the potential to kill millions. In fact, the potential destruction wrought by a singular nuclear attack was predicted to be so catastrophic that citizens of both the United States and the Soviet Union were instructed to build fallout shelters, reflecting the global threat of nuclear weaponry. As each combatant relentlessly tried to one-up the other, it became apparent to the leaders of each nation that in order to promote peace and protect the population, provisions must be made. A form of compromise during this tumultuous period presented itself in the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, commonly known as SALT. In 1967, President Johnson initiated the SALT by meeting Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin in Glassboro, New Jersey. This convention, known as the Glassboro Summit, intended to reduce the number of anti-ballistic missiles, or missiles designed to intercept enemy warheads, possessed by each country. The ambitious goals were not met, but the meeting sponsored future diplomatic action and laid the foundation for weapon reductions in later years. On November 17, 1969, President Nixon excitedly wrote to the American ambassador Gerard C. Smith, "You are embarking upon one of the most momentous negotiations ever entrusted to an American delegation." Nixon was referring to the commencement of SALT I, a formalized segment of the talks initiated by Johnson, and he did not overstate the magnitude of the moment. The negotiations, which began in Helsinki, Finland, culminated in the signing of both the Interim SALT Agreement and the ABM Treaty on May 26, 1972, in Moscow. The Interim Agreement limited the quantity of ICBMs and SLBMs to those already in operation at the time of the signing, thereby checking the threat of these devastating nuclear weapons. In addition, the ABM Treaty reduced the number of anti-ballistic missiles to 200 and the number of ABM deployment sites to 2 for each country. This discouraged each power from bombing the other, since the weaker defenses provisioned by the treaty made it impossible for one nation to attack and then retreat behind their own defenses effectively. As a result, the ABM Treaty increased the accountability of each side and made a long stride towards stability. The ABM Treaty clearly reflects the spirit of compromise in that both sides had to sacrifice a valuable portion of their national defense in order to ensure international peace. Not only did the far-sighted provisions of these treaties quell the clamor of the nuclear arms race, they also established a precedent of benevolent relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, easing the tensions of the Cold War. President Nixon's visit to the Soviet Union during the Moscow summit represented the first time an American president set foot in Moscow, reinforcing the overall recognition that each side must leave their comfort zone for any real progress to be made. In fact, Harry R. Haldeman, Nixon's personal secretary, in his diaries documenting the SALT, claimed that the day of the signing proceeded smoothly, with everybody getting a great feeling of the historic nature of the occasion. The signing of the SALT I treaties truly was historic, as Nixon and Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, the signers of SALT I treaties, overcame their differences in order to compromise for the greater good. Still, SALT I was not without flaws. It failed to limit the total number of nuclear warheads each side could have, or to prohibit the accumulation of MIRVs. Consequently, more enduring agreements in the temporary interim agreement were necessary if true arms reductions were to be reached. A subsequent round of negotiations known as SALT II ensued immediately after the signing of the SALT I treaties, intending to improve upon and advance the compromising spirit of SALT I. In 1974, President Gerald Ford and Soviet General Secretary Brezhnev came to a partial consensus at the Vladivostok summit. The provisions of this negotiation limited the total number of strategic missiles, including ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers, to 2,400, and the quantity of missiles equipped with MIRVs to 1,320. In addition, newly invented types of strategic missiles were completely prohibited. However, Ford and Brezhnev could not agree on the total number of nuclear bombs that each side should have. As a result, negotiations continued until June 18, 1979, when President Carter and Brezhnev signed the SALT II treaty in Vienna. This treaty limited the total number of warheads to 2,250, of which no more than 1,320 could be ICBMs. Of these 1,320 ICBMs, no more than 820 could be equipped with MIRVs. SALT II prescribes strict limits on nuclear arsenals for the first time in the Cold War, provisioning a collective decrease of about 50,000 nuclear warheads. However, the treaty was never formally ratified by Congress, and when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979, Carter requested that the treaty be withdrawn altogether. Still, both parties agreed to respect the compromise until the treaty expired in 1985, relieving the worst hazards of the nuclear arms race. Although unsuccessful in the long run, the SALT II treaty simulated dedicated efforts to slow the nuclear arms race, encouraging future diplomatic activity between the United States and the Soviet Union. Even after SALT II, nuclear weaponry posed a grave threat to people around the world. However, both SALT I and II slowed the breakneck pace of nuclear proliferation and prompted world leaders to continue to seek permanent solutions to the crisis. As the nuclear arsenals reached ever more dangerous heights, the need for compromise was of the utmost importance. Since the strategic arms limitation talks compelled the United States and the Soviet Union to overcome their ideological differences and to sacrifice large portions of their nuclear arsenals for the common good, they are evidently some of the most important compromises in history.